It's the Church of Jesus Christ.
We are pleased to be joined on Truths That Transform by Alex Kochman, who is the Director of Communications for the Association of Baptists for World Evangelism. Alex, thank you so much for joining us on Truths That Transform.
Thank you for having me.
It seems that issues of missions and issues of immigration are extremely closely related, and you, with your missions focus, have given this a lot of thought. Is that true, and how so that immigration issues and missions issues are closely related?
They're very tightly related, and one of the things that was instilled in me as I was beginning to study a Christian theology of missions and loving the nations, it became apparent to me that if I'm going to love the nations well, I need to learn to love my nation well. And we really can't, as much as we'd like to, and it can be uncomfortable to combine the two, but all of these issues relate to each other. We have to make right distinctions, right category differentiations between what is the role of a missionary, what is the role of the church, what is the role of the government or the state, the civil magistrate, and understand what are the duties that pertain to each station as well. And so right now, at a time when we see the nation certainly coming into the U.S., there's particular duties with the gospel that we have, and then there's also things that we're talking about in mainstream media and across the cultural conversation about, okay, what do we do with our national identity as a result of that?
Those are really important issues, and let's delve into some of the specifics of that, Alex, because I think what's happened is a lot of Christians are caught a little bit in a misunderstanding that frankly, many people have preyed upon. And that misunderstanding is we, of course, are called to carry the gospel to the world. We are, of course, called to love our neighbor. We are called to show, grace and hospitality to the sojourner and so forth. And that has been used as a lever to tell Christians, you have to support illegal immigration, and if you want strong borders or if you want anything less than open immigration, you are failing to obey Christ. I think a lot of Christians sort of feel that tension. They maybe know there's something wrong with that, but not quite what it is. How do we parse through that issue?
Yeah, the question itself, I love the way that you framed it, because so often we as Christians are bound by our empathy, our compassion, and it can be easy for bad actors to emotionally manipulate Christians. We know that we have an obligation to love our neighbor and to love other groups outside of ourselves. And so that's really where the leverage tends to come upon us. But I was just speaking with a missionary serving in North Africa among Muslims, and he reached out with a question. He said, I'm struggling, even in light of recent comments that Vice President Vance has made about the order of loves. He says, I'm struggling to understand how a Christian should love his own country. He says, essentially, because I'm a missionary, I've seen this go the opposite direction. We need to love the whole world. And he sort of comes into me with this question. I responded to him simply, the number one, as a missionary, you're deciding, I'm going to love another nation. So love of nation is a thing. It's a category that's essential. But number two is that I'm very concerned that the modern aesthetic of multiculturalism, the idea of open borders, of open societies, of diversity being our strength, and really this entire liberal perspective that has been embraced broadly by the culture on both sides of the aisle, not just liberal in a political sense, but in the broadest sense possible. But this vision of multiculturalism, globalism that we've all adopted is a counterfeit to the biblical vision. There is a biblical vision for every nation and people and tribe and culture gathered around the throne of the Lamb. And that's what happens through missions, is that we're to go out and get those nations and those people groups. But instead, I think what we've done is we've adopted a government-driven, policy-driven alternative to that, that lacks the gospel power and the biblical impetus behind it. So I'm very concerned that we return to the biblical model of the missionary perspective rather than a deracinated government-led version of the same thing.
So let's talk a little bit about J.D. Vance's recent comments with Fox News, where he talked about the order of loves, as we've called it, the Ordo Amoris. This is an ancient Christian doctrine. I think it also has a biblical basis, and yet many people reacted to it in a surprised way, including evangelical Christians. Tell us about what J.D. Vance was talking about. Is it true? Is it biblical?
It's true both in church history and in the biblical record as well. You can go to Augustine, you can go to Thomas Aquinas, you can go to more modern writers and thinkers like C.S. Lewis and see this idea of an order of loves, which doesn't necessarily always result in a strict pecking order, but it does mean that we love each object that we're called to love in the right way, in the way that accords with its nature. Because of who God is, we are to love him above all else. But because of the way that the Lord has assigned to each of us, family members, a household, a neighborhood, a community, a local church, there are particular duties that go with loving each of those within our sphere of influence that I can't necessarily love someone who's so far outside of my sphere of influence in the same way, somebody that I'll never meet and never interact with on the other side of the world. But it's also a biblical concept as well. You look at Galatians chapter 6. Paul says, do good to all, but especially to those who are of the household of faith. There's an idea that, and we say this colloquially, charity begins at home, but it really does. We're called to make disciples of the nations. Well, that starts with teaching my children, and that starts with sharing the gospel with my family and my neighbors. And yes, it does extend to loving the nations and sharing the gospel with those that are unreached and far off. But it's never to the neglect of those first responsibilities that we have to those the Lord has placed near and dear to us. The political conversation right now is, well, what do you do with this America First policy? And somebody reached out to me recently with concerns over that very phrase. But I have a hard time seeing how somebody who is given the stewardship of governing a nation can have any other policy but that nation first. That's the duty that they've been called to undertake. America's leaders putting America first, Russia's leaders putting Russia first, the UK's leaders putting the UK first, and so on and so forth. And that's the duty that makes sense in light of what the civil magistrate is called to do. For us as Christians, as individual believers, we're given this model of Scripture to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind and strength first, to love your neighbor as yourself. And how do I love my neighbor? How do I love humanity? Well, I love them in particular ways because I'm limited by time and space. I love my family. I love my neighborhood, my church, and as the Lord would give opportunity and would call, I am to love those that are far off, the widow, the sojourner, and even the unreached people group. But I have to be realistic about my capacity, and I need to make sure that as I love them, I'm loving them well, and I'm not loving them to the exclusion of my immediate duties to those around me.
It seems that a lot of shenanigans go on underneath misattributing what the Bible is telling us to do, what the Bible is telling the government to do, what the Bible is telling the church to do. The fact that Jesus makes a command to his disciples does not necessarily mean that the state is supposed to operate according to the same standards. When Jesus says, love your neighbor, a state is not good at loving, and that's not necessarily the job of a state. What is the way that we sort of parse that out, and how has mixing those things up been used to smuggle in all sorts of leftist thinking?
And John, I love the question because this is something that Christians have done throughout the ages. They've distinguished between the duties to an individual, the way that a state actor would apply the commands of Christ, the commands of Scripture. And those things aren't always identical. I can turn the other cheek, but the civil magistrate is not called to turn the other cheek. They're called to bear the sword of justice. Romans 13 tells us that the government exists to punish evildoers and to reward the good. And so for us, what that looks like is there are particular commands in Scripture that do pertain to governments and states and rulers. In the Old Testament, we're reminded not to move the landmark, the boundary marker that your fathers have set up. So borders, property lines, those things matter to God. That's a part of how he's ordered the world and the stewardship that he's given to the state. In Romans 13 and 1 Peter, we read that we are to submit to governments and laws so far as they don't contradict the law of God, which means that Christians can't be complicit in the law breaking that does happen with, for instance, something like illegal immigration. Now, for individual believers as well, and for the church, there is a mandate to make disciples of all nations, to disciple the nations. The gospel has to go to every ethnicity, every people group, every language, and every geopolitical country as well. But it's interesting to me, at least, that in order for that to happen, that means there have to be nations. There have to be countries. The distinctions matter, and the distinctions aren't erased at the end of the book in Revelation where they're all gathered around the throne. The distinctions remain. Each nation, as such, is rendering worship to God in the end of the age. And so what that tells me is that those distinctions do matter. And if we're supposed to disciple each nation, that means that each nation is distinct, has its own identity, and we should cherish that and recognize the grace of God in that, rather than seeking to erase distinctions, erase differentiations, erase borders even, and belong to sort of a global community. I look at the Tower of Babel and I see how that went last time. And I don't think that it went particularly well, but I think that if we are honoring the people and places that God has providentially brought about in time and space, and if we have healthy churches that are submitting to government, but are also willing to go and send people to disciple each of these distinct nations and people groups, I think that's the right way of approaching these issues.
Alex Kochman, these are tremendous insights, careful distinctions, which are something that are badly needed in today's church and in evangelical Christianity. Thanks for joining us on Truths That Transform.
Thank you for having me.